I'm mainly a philosopher of art. I also sort of dabble in philosophy of language, feminist philosophy, political philosophy. But what I'm going to present to you today is a project I've been thinking about for quite a while. But as you might have learned going to all these talks and meeting philosophers, philosophy is done quite slowly. So I'm still working on this paper. I have been for a few years now. Other things get in the way, you know, teaching, admin. It's amazing how much admin academics today have to do. So any feedback you have, like the Q&A, will genuinely be useful for me because I'm still writing the paper up before I send it off to journals, inevitably to be rejected as well, because that also happens a lot. But I'm hoping at some point for this to get out into the real world of academic journals. So the question of immoral artists, hopefully it'll be quite obvious that I will be discussing some problematic people. So just a brief content warning. I will be discussing paedophiles, anti-Semitism, and I will briefly be showing paintings of colonialist gender-based violence. So the problem of the immoral artist is it's a very old problem, but it seems like it's only really gained traction in the public domain in the last 10 years or so. And this is just one brief example of what's going on right now. So this was a Slovenian priest called Rupnik, Father Rupnik, who has created lots of beautiful mosaics in multiple churches, including America. And it was recently found out that, well, he's been accused of sexually assaulting, I think it's something like 30 to 40 women, and also being accused of manipulation and controlling behavior. And since then, there's been a call for his mosaics to be removed from various churches. So this question then of how we react to the artist's immorality has very real world consequences. It can result in artworks being removed from their original places, or in some cases the artworks being destroyed. So you might remember a few years ago, Jimmy Carr on Channel 4 was destroying an audience. TV audience would vote to whether or not to destroy or keep an artwork made by an immoral artist. So it's a bit of a blurry picture, but this is a still from the program where everyone voted to destroy a watercolor by Adolf Hitler. And the watercolor was simply just of it. I think it was from 1921, and it was simply of a church, possibly in Vienna. And everyone voted to destroy it, and then Jimmy Carr kind of awkwardly lowered it into this weird chainsaw machine. So the watercolor was totally destroyed into shreds. And you might remember from 2019 when there was a Netflix program came out called Finding Neverland, where even more robust accusations of child abuse were made against the late Michael Jackson. And around that time, as a result, various radio stations across the world actually banned playing Michael Jackson songs from the radio. And coming back as well to this news item again from 2019, going back to Hitler's paintings, Hitler will be a central case study that we'll look at today. But one of the main kind of criticisms of his paintings isn't so much about that he made them, but people just think they're kind of shit, right? People don't think that they have any artistic value, they're accused of being amateurish. But as I'll try and argue and show you, that's the least of our worries with Hitler's art. So it's a problem that has very real world implications. But this is a deeply philosophical question, because you tend to find the public firmly divided, right, on how we should approach this problem. There are some people who think that we should keep the art and the artist entirely separate. An artist's moral life, their personality, how they treated others, any crimes they might have committed, this has no bearing on how we should interpret their artworks. So you may well recognize this man here. This is Paul Gauguin, who's a French artist from the 19th century. And he became very famous for his portraits of mainly his child brides when he visited Tahiti and other islands in the South Pacific. And there's a lot of good to say about his paintings. I'm not here to try and bash Gauguin, right, and his well, I am bits, but the quality of his work, right, it was really pushing Impressionism to its limits. It was sort of going into a kind of post-Impressionism with his use of colours and symbolism. But people get quite protective of their favourite artists, and they tend to think that it doesn't really matter that Gauguin was a sexual predator, and that when he was in Tahiti, he used his sort of patriarchal and colonial advantage as a white man and married and had sex with multiple girls as young as 12 and 13. But people think, well, no, that doesn't matter. We should just keep the art from the artist separate. We should just interpret these kind of paintings for their internal aesthetic value alone. Now, philosophically, and unfortunately I don't have time to fully show you this today, philosophically, I believe that is completely the wrong way of going about it. And that's because if you separate the creator from the artwork, you're actually not treating the artwork as an artwork, right? Artworks are not just pretty things that fall out of the sky. They are fully embedded in the context in which they are created. They're created by people at a certain time and place. They respond to events in the world. It's very much an expression of a person. They're artists often trying to communicate a world to us. So Gauguin, amongst many things, was trying to communicate a nostalgic kind of vision he had for Tahiti, which he wanted to see as a kind of Eden that was free from the claws of Western civilization. So I'm kind of going to be assuming this broad philosophical point here that to really understand an artwork, you have to consider its origin. We can absolutely come back to that in the Q&A if you want me to try and persuade you a bit more. The problem, though, with this general philosophical position that I will be adopting is where to draw the line. If the artist does have something to do with how we interpret and value their art, at what point how far do we bring in that artist? Do we actually take seriously their moral personality, for instance, when interpreting their work? So with that question in mind, this is a plan for the talk. I'll be looking at 3 central cases and looking at 2 existing approaches to the problem of how an artist's morality or immorality affects the content of their art. What is the artwork saying, doing? These are going to be 2, this is a very contemporary philosophy talk, right? Because philosophers have only really recently started to really dig into this question. I'll then zoom in on what I'm calling the Hitler problem and show that these 2 current approaches in the literature, which are only about 3 years old, they don't accommodate Hitler's paintings, but I'm going to try and persuade you that they should. And so what we need is a new account of how to deal with the immoral artist. And then I'm going to be looking at how to deal with really hard cases of where there doesn't seem to be any kind of relation between the artist and their art. So the 3 central cases I'm going to be looking at. First one is an easy case. So easy cases are where an artist's immorality is directly relevant to the art they make because they have depicted it, right? So again, this is one of Gauguin's paintings of one of his child brides, Stehamina. This is a painting of her where she was lying in fear one night waiting for him to come home. And we know this from his diaries that he was writing at the time. He wanted to capture this moment of fear in her eyes of her sort of husband coming home, because she knew what was going to happen, right? Now, art historians have shown that this is a very sort of sexualized painting. It's kind of eroticizing a moment before sexual violence is going to happen. I'm calling this an easy case because the artist's immorality is smack bang in the middle of the artwork. In this case, Gauguin is depicting his child brides. Need you say more? Then we have what I'm calling a less easy case. So these are cases where the artist's immorality is not very obvious in their art at all. So this is one of Hitler's paintings, and I'll be coming back to Hitler's art more generally later. But Hitler generally worked in oils and watercolors, and most of his paintings look, at first glance, very innocent. Sometimes quite pretty, quite delicate. They tend to be landscapes and street scenes. The problem, though, is that Hitler's immorality, the atrocities he committed when he was alive, they're not depicted, right? In fact, it's the complete opposite. They're normally very peaceful scenes where there's no violence or anti-Semitic content shown in them. So that's going to be one of the central cases we'll look at, is how and should we accommodate this? And lastly, a case I'm calling a hard case. These are cases where the artist's immorality, it's not clear you can find a trace at all in the artwork. So this is Rolf Harris's, two of his paintings that my parents, they didn't have the originals, but they had prints of them. So I sort of grew up with these in the house. And when it came to light about his child sex offences, my parents freaked out and just removed the prints from the frames and put some other prints in them because they didn't want them up in the house. But these particular paintings, there's absolutely no trace at all of the artist's immorality. We've got the lifelong friends painting here, two old men sat on a wall. And on the right here, we have an Australian landscape called Blue Hills. There's nothing to do with paedophilia in there. So how should we approach these kinds of cases? So I think that these three central cases kind of encapsulate the kind of spectrum, the different ways an artist's immorality, the different ways that we have art made by immoral people. So I'm going to be looking now at two approaches that currently exist in the literature and how they deal with these central cases. So we first of all have the empiricist approach. And I call it that because these philosophers think that for an artist's immorality to be at all relevant to the content of their art, you have to see it. It has to be literally depicted in the work. There has to be very straightforward evidence. That's why it's called an empiricist approach. There has to be straightforward evidence of the artist's misdeeds in the work. And that could vary depending on the genre of the piece. So here again, we have Gauguin's portrait of one of his child brides. His sexualized attitude towards these girls is very apparent in the works. It's a very kind of complicated way of putting it. Manifest structure basically just means that we can kind of work it out by just what we're given in the work itself. There's a lot of visual eroticization here. Another example that's often given, moving away from the visual arts, is in music, right? Sometimes we can find direct evidence, straightforward evidence of the artist's misdeeds because they often sing about it. So this is one of R. Kelly's songs that he wrote for his child bride, Aaliyah, I think in the 90s. And the song is called Age Ain't Nothing But a Number. And he wrote that for his child bride, I think when she was 14, and she then sang it. So Aaliyah then became a kind of mouthpiece for R. Kelly, kind of literally justifying his paedophilic tendencies, right? So again, very straightforward evidence of the immorality in the artwork. But that empiricist approach is kind of the main approach floating around in the literature at the moment. But there's another one made by an Australian philosopher called Ted Nalicelli. And he thinks that the straightforward evidence that we're given in artwork, there's more to say there. And really we should be looking at the artist's motivations behind the work. So for instance, this is a painting by another paedophile, sorry, Graham Ovenden, who often painted and took photos of young girls. Now, for the sake of argument, it's not the best example, but for the sake of argument, let's just assume in this painting that there's no straightforward sexualization of a girl here. But when we learn that Ovenden, when painting this piece, did it with an aim to get sexual gratification from it, or to kind of get some arousal from painting it, it seems then that that immoral motivation behind the work is going to affect how, it's going to reframe how we interpret the artwork. So Nanacelli says that even though there's no straightforward aesthetic, like immediate indication of sexualization here, he says it seems entirely plausible that the painting is morally flawed as a result of the morally reprehensible motivation from which it was likely created. Now, the reason this is often given as a kind of rival approach to the empiricists is because these kind of what we could call motivationists, they don't think that empiricists can deal with cases like this because there's not enough straightforward evidence of immorality in the art itself. But in this case, when we learn the artist's motivation, it's going to reframe our understanding of the work. And in this case, we now see it as an instance of child pornography. So learning an artist's reasons for creating a work, for that work itself, is going to have a very real effect on the genre. In this case, we don't just have a simple picture of a girl, we have an instance of child pornography. And to kind of really show why this approach is perhaps one you might want to agree with, we can do what philosophers call a modal thought experiment. So what I mean by that is I want you to imagine that this painting on the left, it looks identical to this one. This is the original made by the paedophile, Graham Ovenden. But imagine in another possible world, the very same painting was made by, say, the girl's sister, who is not a paedophile and had no such immoral motivation. She was just learning how to paint and she did this portrait for a school project or something. It seems like, even though we have formally two identical works of art, just knowing who they came from and why and how and when and why they were created, we're going to have two very different works of art here. One, perhaps a loving portrait of a family member. Here, an instance of child pornography. Morally neutral or morally good, immoral work of art. So it does seem then that an artist's motivations directed at an individual work of art is going to have very real effects on what the work of art is about, and indeed what its moral properties are. So those are the two approaches we've got, right? The empiricist and the motivationist. But they both come up against a problem that I'm calling the Hitler problem. And this is what we're calling the less easy cases. Neither of our approaches can deal or accommodate Hitler's paintings. So, this is another one of Hitler's paintings, very classic for his kind of style and oeuvre, which I'll explain more in a sec. We have mountains and a sort of little forest, not sure exactly what's going on at the bottom there, but this is a very classic kind of, I think it's watercolors by Hitler. Now the empiricist would have to say, well, okay, there's no obvious anti-Semitic or Nazi standpoint or attitude perceptible in these paintings. Remember, the empiricist is looking for straightforward, literal evidence of immorality. But there's no anti-Semitic caricature shown, which was obviously very standard during the Nazi propaganda regime. a lot of the time Jewish people were shown in very kind of appalling ways. There's a lot of dehumanization going on. It was very easy to trace immorality in those images. But in Hitler's own art, there weren't any anti-Semitic caricatures. There are no clear kind of Nazi symbols like swastikas. These would be a clear trace of Hitler's immorality in his art that the empiricist would be looking for. In fact, it's because Hitler's art doesn't have swastikas in it that means it's actually legal to sell his paintings in Germany. I don't think that, well, they do sell surprisingly well. So one of the proponents of our empiricist approach, who is a philosopher from the United States, he's very much an empiricist. We've got into an argument about this on Twitter. He says that his kind of empiricist approach does not give us any clear reason for thinking that Hitler's egregious immorality has anything to do with his unobtrusive cityscapes or landscapes and so on. But he sees this as a merit of his view, because Matthes describes Hitler's paintings as quiet, anodyne, and certainly not immoral. And he notes that, we might recoil from them simply because Hitler made them. But Matthes insists that suggests that Hitler's artworks are somehow morally and aesthetically tainted by the atrocities of the maker would be, I quote, absurd. But as I'm going to show, actually, I'm going to be going for that absurd conclusion and try and show you it's not absurd at all. In fact, this is a real limitation of the empiricist view because it has this result as a theory. The motivation is, though, they can't really accommodate, they might have an easier way of dealing with Hitler's paintings, but remember, they were thinking in terms of a directed motivation behind an individual work of art. But we should assume, as is likely, that Hitler did not have a relevant, specific motivation every time he sat down to work at his art. As you will know, artists don't generally sit down and have a directed intent every time, like for their artwork to express a certain deep moral message. As I'll show you, people tend to criticize him being a bad artist, but actually, he had quite a lot in common with very good artists. He had a huge oeuvre. He produced a lot of work. He famously failed to get into art school, but he very much had an artistic practice. So I don't think it's plausible to think that every time he sat down at his canvas or paper that he would have an evil motivation every time he sat down. That's just not how artists work, even someone like Hitler. So I don't think the motivation approach as it currently stands would be able to say that Hitler's evil crimes have any artistic relevance for his paintings. So under our two current approaches, Hitler's immorality does not influence the content of his art. Assuming he didn't have this kind of evil Nazi or anti-Semitic motivation directed towards each painting, and there is no immediate or straightforward aesthetic evidence in his paintings of his crimes. But I want to suggest, even agreeing with all of this, I want to suggest that there's actually a far more subtle connection between Hitler and his art. And to do this, we need to understand the art historical facts that surround Hitler's art making. Hitler's art, like most artists, didn't just sort of drop out of the sky out of nowhere. It was heavily influenced by his own favorite artists at the time and his own favorite kind of mythologies and folklore that were developing at the time. So not all of these paintings here are Hitler's, but you might think they all look quite similar. This one down here of the family, this is a case of Nazi propaganda. So this was a very much kind of Aryan artwork at the time. This down here on the bottom left, this is one of Hitler's pieces. Apparently this one of the Mary and Jesus, apparently that's supposed to be them. That's one of Hitler's. But Hitler's art was inspired by neoclassicism, a kind of German romanticism, and from that the kind of stylistic similarities that would come from that. So a kind of realism, detail, straight lines, a kind of neatness to his work, quite a sort of gentle palette. And all of this was influenced by the kind of German romanticism that was circling around the time, mainly in the 19th century. But out of that German romanticism came this so-called Germanic spirit. So this was a kind of what we could call an early proto-Nazi style or mythology. Now, the Germanic spirit is a kind of mystical, kind of nostalgic entity that looks back to kind of pastoral Germany in the face of decaying Western civilization. And it was this nostalgia for this kind of pastoral Germany that was kind of hinted at in a lot of the works that was circulating at the time. So Hitler started making his art in 1909 in Austria, and that was obviously just before he went to the front line in the First World War. But it's when he emerged out of having been in the trenches, he started, he was very angry and disillusioned with the depressed state of Germany after the First World War, and he started making a lot of art at that time. But a lot of it was harking back to the kind of folk in the fields, and this kind of early developing kind of Aryan aesthetics, which eventually, of course, culminated into Nazi art. And here we have an example of one of the pieces here. But the point here is that Hitler had a very clear style. You might not think it's very good, but this is one art historian here, Frederick Swats, who says that Hitler's painterly style was rooted in a naturalistic German tradition. You've got concrete and identifiable subjects, clean lines and attention to detail, and this is a bit of an inflammatory remark, I guess, but he says his repertoire was narrow, he rarely gave his scenes life or feeling. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we need to situate Hitler's art in this kind of growing proto-Nazi style at the time. His love of neoclassicism, for instance, didn't just come out of nowhere. That was because he felt that the ancient Greek and kind of Roman body was the kind of racial superior kind of racialized body, and this was part of the growing kind of Nazi mythology, which thought that the kind of cradle of civilization, which people back then tended to think of like the ancient Greeks, they're saying that these people used to actually be Nordic. So it's part of this Nazi mythology that it was Germany that gave birth to civilization, which is apparently why people like Hitler were so obsessed with Greek and Roman figures. This is another art historian who's kind of looking more closely at Hitler's paintings themselves, and he kind of connects it to the Nazi art that eventually developed a few decades later. And he says, people were shorn of all individuality and became mere emblems expressive of assumed eternal truths. In looking at Nazi architecture, art, or painting, one quickly gains the feeling that the faces, shapes, and colours all serve a propagandistic purpose. They are all the same stylized statements of Nazi virtues: power, strength, solidarity, Nordic beauty. So what I think we need to do here is actually philosophers need to do some art history, basically. So we need to think about Hitler's early art, even before Nazism as a kind of regime really took off. His art still had a proto-Nazi style, and as a whole, this style formed an overall oeuvre. And they had behind this oeuvre perhaps not specified motivations for each individual painting, There are definitely generalized kind of, and thereby immoral motivations towards his oeuvre that form his artistic practice. So what I'm basically suggesting is that we need to take what's good from those two existing approaches. We need to expand both of them. We need to think of, yes, there should be some evidence of immorality in the art, but perhaps it's not immediately obvious. Perhaps it's because the immorality is sort of buried or hidden in the kind of style of the work. And taking what was good about the motivationist approach, we should include the artist's motivations, but not kind of in this simplistic way where we're just looking at what the artist was thinking about every time they sat down at the canvas. Again, artists have an artistic practice that as a whole has an immoral motivation. So in Hitler's case, he had kind of general immoral motivations behind the work, because at this time he was developing this kind of proto-Nazi style of art making, this kind of yearning, this kind of romantic, pastoral, racially pure Germany. When you situate his work in that overall context, suddenly it does look quite sinister. So again, we can do one of those modal thought experiments again. This is another one of Hitler's paintings of a person kind of sat at the bottom of a mountain and a water scene and a waterfall. Imagine again, this is the original down here, but imagine in a possible world, a woman who had no such kind of anti-Semitic inclinations, was just using her new watercolors, and she wasn't aware of kind of neoclassicism and how it connects to kind of Nazi mythology. It does seem then that we'd want to say that this original work of art by Hitler belongs to that proto-Nazi style, even though it looks exactly the same as the other one. Knowing that Hitler painted that original was going to reframe your understanding of those paintings. Suddenly it seems like this original one is tracking a kind of Aryan idealistic aesthetic, which the possible one made by someone else who had no such intention, we just wouldn't say it would belong to that style. So I want to briefly pause on some of Hitler's other paintings and drawings. He did a lot of drawings of dogs. And again, this is a classic case again of like, well, this is one of his drawings of his own dog, who's a German Shepherd called Blondie. Again, oh, Hitler's immorality, what? It's just a dog, right? It's got nothing to do with it. But no, as soon as you start digging, dogs, especially German Shepherds, very close to wolves, but wolves were a huge part of Nazi mythology, right? It was part of a kind of folklore that the Nazis were relying on, which is it's part of this Germanic spirit where they tended to see the ancient sort of Germans as being werewolves. This was their kind of like soul animal. And Jewish people were seen as the vampire, and the werewolf had to defeat the vampire. So I'm not sure exactly where the folklore comes from, but the wolf very much represented this Germanic spirit. And the wolf itself was on Nazi uniforms. It was in the names of various military bases. And of course, Hitler himself loved having dogs around. It was just part of his propaganda, was that, look, I'm an animal lover. And Adolf itself means wolf. So even a dog, a simple kind of innocent looking dog painting, as soon as you dig down a bit, you can see that the artist's morality absolutely is in this work of art, even though there's no direct evidence. Another example, an innocent bouquet of alpine flowers. Again, Hitler made this painting. Well, as our empiricist would say, mappers, well, to claim this would be absurd. Hitler's immorality is at all affecting this work of art. But again, it's alpine flowers, and one of these flowers is the, probably mispronouncing, thank you, yes. The Edelweiss, and this, of course, at the time was a very clear symbol of the Nazi regime very much uses a symbol of strength, and it then was turned on its head. I think it was then used as resistance to the Nazis. But when Hitler was painting it, he was using it as this very clear symbol. So again, not just flowers. So they're the kind of less easy cases, and I've tried to show you a kind of sketch and account that we need to think in terms of an artist's general practice. What art did they like? Where does their art come from? What are their general motivations behind their work? You need to think more holistically when we look at an artist's moral character behind their work. But this still doesn't get around what I'm calling hard cases. So this is where we have art made by a bad person, but cases where we have no straightforward evidence of the immorality. We have no directed kind of immoral motivation behind the work, but nor do we have this kind of more subtle connection that I've been trying to argue for. There's nothing in the style. There's no kind of generalized immoral artistic motivation that forms part of the artist's wider practice that we can kind of shoehorn in here to try and establish a link between the artist's immorality and their art. So examples of this would be, you might think of some counterexamples to this, but I think a lot of Michael Jackson's songs, when you even look at the lyrics, you'd be quite hard pressed to find a direct expression of paedophilia. Picasso's Man with Guitar, the fact that Picasso was a misogynist, seems to only really affect his paintings of women. So you can see again, the empiricist is still doing some work there. But how do we read that into his paintings that are not of women, for instance? Another sort of odd painting from Gauguin, Still Life with Puppies. Just puppies and fruit, seems quite innocent. How are we establishing a connection there? And again, of course, we have Rolf Harris's Blue Hills painting. And again, we can do that thought experiment a third and final time. It doesn't look like these can pass that modal test. We have the original Blue Hills here, made by Rolf Harris. Imagine I told you in another possible world that I happen to have created the very same painting. It doesn't seem like you'd want to say, just because Rolf Harris made this painting, that the painting itself is immoral. It's simply of an Australian landscape. But remember, we don't really have that artistic background that we have with Hitler. So Hitler's landscapes, they are like wolves in sheep's clothing, basically, because the landscape was part of this nostalgia, this nostalgic romantic vision he had for Germany, right? This isn't the case in Rolf Harris's case. It was simply just, in fact, he himself said that this painting was purely an experiment with leftover paint he had from another project. He had no motivation for it. That we actually have this on record that he said he just started playing with paint. So he didn't really know what he was doing. So this is why this is a hard case. The fact that Rolf Harris was convicted child sex offender, it's not really affecting his art in any significant way. But we're then left with this problem of how we're supposed to explain our felt kind of repulsion, or perhaps explain my parents' decision to remove these paintings from their house. It seems like that's not purely an irrational thing to do. It seems like we're perhaps responding to something significant in the artwork. And I think maybe we can start to explain this by just making a seemingly simple distinction between an artwork and a mere artifact, right? So artworks are things, they're special artifacts, if you will. I'm not going to try and define what an artwork is today, but they're artifacts in a very loose sense. But we have lots of artifacts that are not artworks. This chair is not an artwork yet. Maybe it could become one, but at the moment it's not. Now, remember though that artworks are still artifacts, they're just special ones. And I think that to explain our felt repulsion or confliction with artworks made by immoral artists when there is no clear trace of the immorality in the artwork itself, the artwork, as in its content, what it's about, its artistic properties, its moral properties, that's not affected by the artist's immorality. but the object that carries the artwork is. So in this case, let's just assume it's a canvas with paint. The fact that that was produced and created by a paedophile, that's what we're responding to. We're not saying that the artwork itself means anything to do with the artist's immorality. It's simply the fact that the object that carries the artwork, the canvas, the material, that is tainted by the artist's immorality. So I think then that the easy and less easy cases, but in those cases, the artwork as an artwork and the object that carries it are affected by the artist's immorality. But in hard cases, we shouldn't have to, as philosophers, try and find a significant connection. It's simply the fact we're repulsed because an object was in front of us was actually created by a monster. And that kind of makes sense why we might not want to go near it, we might not want to look at it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the artwork itself is at all tainted by the artist's immorality. Don't know what I'm doing for time, but I'm finished.
Yeah, good.
That's
Perfect.
good. Thank you so much.
Do you have a seat?
I was just about to give you a 2-minute, 5-minute, but that's perfect. Thank you. Great. I expect we will have a lot of questions. I think I saw Adrian dressed for the part. Well done. Who's going to help run around the audience and gather some questions. I'll just maybe ask a couple while you prepare some thoughts. And yeah, I found it very convincing actually, Daisy. I thought you had to have a lot that I was at all skeptical about, but it made great sense. So how does the artifact point apply to the Michael Jackson case where there's no physical object that's tainted? Is the abstract object tainted as a digital artifact?
Yeah.
How do you apply that one?
I was worried someone was going to ask this question. This is like the sketchiest bit of the paper actually, because I think that it's easy. So what motivated that point was actually a sort of happier instance where why is it that when you go to an art gallery and you finally see your favorite painting or favorite artist's work, but it's an original, why is that such a special experience? And it's because you feel close to the artist. Like when I saw Van Gogh's Starry Night for the first time, it was just so magical because I felt I could see the way he'd created this material object in front of me, and that's what explained that kind of very intense emotional experience I had, because I felt quite close to him because I was close to an object he created. So that's kind of what motivated that point, that we overlook the kind of objectness of artworks and how these were kind of created by, in some cases, these wonderful people that we've never met, but they feel like friends because we're. But that doesn't really work with the music case, because as you say, it's an abstract work of art.
Assuming that his songs don't convey immoral.
Yeah, this is all
purposes in
assuming
some
there's no content.
Subtle way.
Yeah, this is all assuming there's no moral content. I think there the idea could still be used, but there it's about having the sonic experience. So the kind of sonic work of art, even if it's not a tangible thing, it has material existence, and that it's, even if it's just sonic, it's the same.
The sounds are emitted by an immoral person.
Yeah, but you're right. It really does create a complication, especially because music is. This is why I don't go near philosophy of music, because it's too complicated. The metaphysics are just really, really tricky, because where does it exist? Where's the original? So.
And the only other thought I had is, we had some talks last season about artificial intelligence and art and the impact of that on copyright and ownership. And there, I guess we'd say the artificially created art can't have any real motivation on the part of the artist, being the computer that created it, but the prompt put into it may or may not have a immoral purpose.
Yeah.
It could be a child wanting to see pictures of other children playing, or it could be one of your immoral artists wanting to see pictures. And there it seems like the motivation comes from the consumer or the patron, the commissioner of the art, not from the artist. So can the immoral motive flow through the artist without them really getting involved if you're commissioned to produce an immoral
That's a really good question.
artwork?
I think there's two things to say there. One is the AI problem, and absolutely, I think AI, the moral properties of an AI work of art is super interesting, and I don't know if many philosophers have started thinking about this, because you do lack that purely human origin. So that's going to make deciphering or identifying moral properties of artwork tricky. But absolutely, you could explain that by the prompt in the same way. So maybe we could get around that by looking at the prompt. But the other case about commissioning works of art, that's really interesting, because because I work on immoral art more generally, and it's not always to do with what the artist necessarily was intending to do. So I always use, Titian is one of my favorite artists. I grew up loving I still do love Titian. I'm not saying he's a bad man. Don't actually know much about him really as a person, but he obviously was famous for producing lots of stunning paintings of sexual violence, and they are this morally. It's really philosophically interesting, because these are terrible acts, but done in a kind of eroticizing way. But he did that for King Philip II. So King Philip was the patron, and he commissioned Titian to do these paintings. So Titian was just doing what he was told. So there, the kind of where the immorality comes from is going to be more complicated. But the king himself wanted his own portrait in the painting, so he was often portrayed as the rapist, which
okay,
that's a whole other thing.
Sounds more problematic.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, okay.
Yeah.
I do think it sort of touches on, though, the morality of the audience and the consumer and the relevance of that. If there was a harmless dog lover who'd always owned German Shepherds and had 15 pictures of German Shepherds around their house, would you go and say, oh, actually that one's evil because let's say it's not Hitler, maybe it's someone less morally questionable than Hitler. Well, questionable.
I think
less evil than Hitler.
Yeah.
But still a bit dodgy. Would you say, well, it had some dubious aesthetic principle going on with that one, so you should probably throw that one out, but the other 15 you could hang on to. They're probably all right.
I think it's a really good question, because in this case, do they all come from the same person, or is it the one of
same owner but all different artists?
Oh, I see.
But all the paintings, like your model case, they all sort of look like reasonable sketches of German Shepherd dogs, but some are part of an evil artistic tradition and some aren't.
Oh, then yes, I'd say that one's an immoral work of art. But again, what I've been trying to show is that philosophical connection between an artist's moral character and the content of their art. What we should do about it is another issue. Should we take this one down? Should we destroy it? Should we do a Jimmy Carr and destroy it as a spectacle? Or should we, in the Gauguin case, should we lock them down in the vaults? Should we burn them? I have opinions on this, but we can come back to that.
And Jimmy Carr's probably on quite thin ice with this whole line of.
Yes, that particular show got a lot of criticism as well.
Great. Well, I'm sure we have quite a few questions in the audience, so do raise your hand so that Adrian and I can see you. We've got 4 already. Adrian, can you see? We'll work our way backwards, and we'll ask you to wave your hands again. So Adrian, we'll have one at the front afterwards, and then we'll send you up. Yeah. Great. Over to you.
I think tainted by source is something that can be applied throughout life. If you take it that every action we take, we're accountable and we are complicit down the line, then you can apply it to buying makeup that's been tested on animals, watching Johnny Depp films, visiting a library that's being funded by BP.
Yeah.
So, to me, that edges towards a moral way of looking at our daily life.
Yeah, definitely. That's a lovely question. Thank you. I think it's two things I want to say about that. One is, which I didn't have time to go into, that motivation approach by Ted Nanicelli, that derives from a kind of virtue ethics, which is this idea that our actions derive their moral value from the moral motivation behind them. So if I was helping out at a homeless shelter purely out of compassion for the homeless community, that would make my action morally better than if you found out that I was doing it purely to impress a new love interest from Tinder or something, right? It would just, it wouldn't be a very good thing. Like the action was morally tainted by the moral motivation. But that kind of general effect on our daily life, I think it's a really interesting one, because if we do things with good intention, objectively good intention, then that is going to have an effect on the moral value of our actions, from wearing makeup to going to a particular gym owned by a certain person, or watching Johnny Depp films and things like that. But I do think it's important to establish that connection between the source and the object or the action. But it's a further question of what we should do about it, because none of us are moral saints. And most of us are not kind of morally consistent. And I think we should sometimes not. It's a sort of more separate ethical question of whether we should we should be kinder to ourselves depending on what we're doing. I'm trying to justify the fact that I've started eating meat again. It's what I used to be a vegan and I've started eating meat again. I'm like, well, I'm not a morally perfect person. But yeah, a lot of things we do are going to be tainted in that way, for sure. Yeah, thank you.
Does seem to have been a shift towards condemning hypocrisy rather than condemning immoral acts themselves.
Yeah, that's true.
As long as you're open about it, you can be president of, anyway, yeah.
Yeah, I thought your book was very interesting. I got a question about how you view art. I'm thinking particularly of art of the past in historical context. For example, the male gaze. I mean, there are a lot of beautiful paintings which involve the male gaze. And how do we view those things? Because my initial response would be, that is of a different time, and we think differently today. And so, therefore, I sort of feel it's justifiable to look at it if it's a beautiful work of art, and if it's original, if it has a special originality. And with regard to that, made me a little sort of unsure about how I should view Gauguin, because I actually like Gauguin's work. I didn't like that painting because it was a pretty violent looking painting, but I find finding it difficult. He was a very original artist, and he pushed the genre forward. And if we're going to criticize and put away these painters, then we will be quite impoverished, I think. And I'm thinking about the same in literature. If you look at literature in the same way.
Can you go into the microphone? It's not.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
You will be quite impoverished, because there will be a huge amount of stuff that you will not look at. And I'm just feeling that's sort of a slight dilemma.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's great. That's a great question.
The historical context is difficult.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So there's so much that your question raises. First of all, with the male gaze thing, I think this actually comes back to that quite significant philosophical position I began with and briefly mentioned, which some philosophers call contextualism. But it's this idea that artworks, their origin is integral to their identity. So with, say, the Renaissance paintings that were part of the, it's generally called it's called the nude genre, but they mean naked women, naked white women, young women, flawless, naked white women. And they were created mainly for a male audience, a wealthy white male audience. And I think it's important when we look at those paintings today in museums and this kind of answers your second question about how to marry that troubling origin with the very beautiful object for us. And I think curators and museums more generally have a responsibility to fully show us this artwork, warts and all, so that we have a fully informed experience. And like I said before, like I grew up just adoring Titian's paintings, and they are very beautiful, but I think they become even more fascinating when you realize how morally problematic they are.
Education with the paint.
Exactly. And I think we owe it to the historical context to fully, and the artists to fully understand it. The fact that Caravaggio killed a man in a drunken brawl, I think that makes his paintings even better. So this is another philosophical position: is does the artwork's immorality make it a better work of art? There are some philosophers who actually think it does. Why do we love Breaking Bad so much? It's because, you know, it's an immoral, hugely immoral kind of like TV series, but that's what makes it so fascinating. So I think we owe it to the quality of the art, the kind of the truth behind it, to have a more honest interaction with the artwork. But when it comes to what to do with it, like with Gauguin's paintings, I don't think we should destroy them. In fact, I think we should, in some cases, make them hyper visible, but in a true, honest way. I think we owe it to the artist, and in fact, and as is often overlooked, we owe it to the people in the paintings as well. I think we owe it to his child brides to fully show these paintings for what they are. And that's just until recently, that just was not being done. They were described as young women. They weren't, they were girls. So I agree with you, that's a real worry about impoverishing our cultural spaces, but I think the actual opposite could happen in that way.
I want to let a few more in. We have one just behind you, Adrian, a couple of rows back. I think you were first. And then we'll come back to you. We have someone at the back, so we'll do lady at the back next, and then you a couple of rows ahead.
Daisy, if I may, my name's Stephen. A message of support in a sense, no question. I'm very interested in effective communication, and communication takes many forms: music, poetry, books, perhaps even food, and certainly art. It's a two-way process between the artist and the viewer or receiver of the information. And yes, you can look at the production without any context at all, and you'll get a certain meaning from it. But if you look at the background and the context of an author, you'll better understand what the devil his characters are up to, and get an idea about what he's writing about and why he's writing it. And it must be the same to me about art. And I think your analysis of Hitler has been very interesting as to the subplot, if you like. But art is surely nothing if it's not seen. And so haven't we got to consider the viewer? Shouldn't you be thinking about the morality of the person who looks at it? And if a perfectly innocent picture you've just been talking about of a naked woman who's absolutely beautiful, draped across something, turns out to be an erotic charge for some viewers, what would you like to do about that? Does that influence in some way the artist himself? I can't quite see it, but what do you think?
That's a great question, thank you. I just want to briefly return to that point about communication. I totally agree with you about art, amongst many other things, being a kind of communication. That's something I've been interested in regards to like philosophy of language as well. Like even the visual arts, I see them as acts of communication from the artist. Obviously, it's trickier than ordinary language because we're often not dealing with a purely sort of contained sign system. So like it's not purely visual language, is kind of different to linguistic language, but I think it's important to see these artworks as like communication from the artist. And I agree with you that I think they, by fully appreciating that communicative act coming from a certain person at a certain place in time, it's going to enhance our experience of the artwork for sure and bring us to a truer understanding of it. But I think question of like the role of the viewer in that is very tricky. I think we need to be careful about, in a metaphysical level, ascribing properties to artworks in a kind of ad hoc way. So I'm trying to think of an example. There was a famous, it's not the best example, there was a famous, I think it's a myth really, but the Aphrodite of Knidos sculpture, which I think was the first ancient Greek sculpture of a woman, with a female body anyway. It apparently sent a man so kind of mad with lust that he assaulted it, that's all I'll say, and then threw himself off a cliff afterwards. Now, even if we just sort of put aside the moral properties of the artwork there, clearly people can react strongly to artworks, and there's a separate question of whether an artwork, we can accuse it of causing people to descend into crime or do something bad in response to it. And I think there are different ways of looking at that in regards to causation. You can either have artworks that incite violence, and that's quite an easier case because the art, when we talk about incitement, normally there's an intention there behind the artwork to incite people. So Nazi, sorry, I keep coming back to Nazi, it's just an easy example. Nazi propaganda was incitement to violence. Like the anti-Semitic films were directly intended to incite violence amongst the audience members in cinemas and things. But there are trickier cases where there is no kind of direct intent to do it. And I think the responsibility there lies more with the person. But yeah, it depends on the nature of the causation between that. But yeah, food for thought. Thank you.
We have a question at the back.
Hi, thank you. It's really interesting. My things that they're not really questions, they're just kind of thought really. If you think that Gauguin can be you can look at Gauguin's art, but you can kind of forgive Gauguin, probably because he didn't cause the Holocaust. Wouldn't you have to apply the same to Hitler? So, you know, if Gauguin's art is acceptable, even though he was a man, he was a predator of young women, not just a predator of young women, but of women of colour, of whom he had imperial dominance over, which makes it kind of double. So if we can forgive him, then why wouldn't we forgive Hitler? Was it to do with the scale of the problem? And then the other thought that I had was, are we judging this based on the biographies of the artists that we happen to know? So would there be art that's just recently been discovered in Pompeii? We don't know who did it, but could actually have been burning Christians as candles, Roman candles. We don't know. So how can you apply this to people that we know, but not to art where we don't know who the person is? And is the intention of the artist important at all? Because maybe when Hitler was doing Alpine scenes, he was just relaxing and wasn't thinking, this is the Aryan homeland. And I'm just chilling in the moment. But actually, since we know what Hitler did, then people contemporarily looking at it, thinking it's beautiful, keeping the name of Hitler alive, is actually, you know, if you think of ethical principles, it would be morally bankrupt to do that, not because the intention of the art had harm, but because what we know of the individual who did it is pernicious and degrades society. And art is, you know, it's an image which makes you think of something, but it is also a vehicle for changing the moral motivation and the dynamic intention of society.
Thank you.
And actually, from that point of view, we need to put moral brakes on it. And so how do we do that?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Lots of really interesting things there. I will return to the first point last about forgiving Gauguin. That sounds like a program or a book or something. the question of the artist's biography, having knowledge of that and how that affects obviously how we're going to interpret their work of art. That's it's a tricky question, because I tend to think that artworks can somewhat have moral property. They can have moral properties as a result of who made them in the ways that I've tried to outline here. But just because the contemporary audience can't decipher those properties, that's an epistemological limitation. So that's an issue of knowledge, but that doesn't mean that the properties aren't there. So it's a bit like, just because we can't see something doesn't mean it's not there. So with the Pompeii example, there probably will be works of art that have certain morally good or morally bad properties as a result of who made them, perhaps, because obviously art and morality has different relations, right? An artwork might be immoral because it was made by a bad person, or it might be immoral because, kind of going back to the Titian case, it was part of a wider visual culture that produced a kind of, it sustained existing issues in society. So I am thinking in terms of there would have been, often find in Pompeii a lot of wall paintings that were found in the brothels and things. And really they were kind of there just to show various sexual positions that you could take. So there was quite a kind of straightforward instructional thing. But the more we learn about these paintings, they were part of a certain damaging way of portraying women, then they're going to have those moral properties, even if we might, as a result of what they were used for at the time. Again, it's all about their origin, it's super important. Just because we might not know about everything about that origin doesn't mean that it's not there. And the last point about, I think what you were hinting at there was this issue of retrospective interpretation. So you're quite right. When Hitler sat down, let's assume, to paint his Alpine bouquet of flowers, I totally agree with you that I don't think we should have to say that he had an evil motivation when he was doing that, because that's just not really how, even like Hitler, that's not how artists tend to work. But I think that's kind of the point of my account, was trying to say that that bouquet of flowers was still part of a holistic artistic practice of his that had influences in that neoclassic style in how it actually appeared, the way he painted, but also what the symbols are on those paintings. There's a reason he chose those flowers. He would have been painting these flowers before he came to power, and he continued to do it throughout being in power as well. But you're right that we shouldn't take an artist's later actions and then relate it just back on their earlier art. But in the case of Hitler, we don't really have that problem, because in 1909, when he started really producing a lot of art, in Mein Kampf, he actually says it was around that time he started developing anti-Semitic beliefs, and kind of his political motivation started happening. So I don't think there's a problem there of reading, like artificially reading back onto his art. I think they were affected by his kind of fledgling, kind of developing immoral motivations, even before the Holocaust.
What about keeping a name alive?
So I do want to give someone else a chance to ask a question. It's hard for us to hear you. So I think we had someone waiting just here. We'll come back to you if you have a moment. Or we can continue in the bar afterwards. Yeah, please.
I'll try and keep it quick. Hi, Dixon. My name's Tim. That's my first time at the Philosophy Club. Thank you for your hospitality. Great. I'm well a legacy bar. Could you maybe speak a little bit about that transience of morality with art therapy, for example? For those people who are deemed immoral to start with, maybe criminals, maybe in prison, and they're then using art as a way to cleanse their morality to become better.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm really interested in the good that art can do, and art therapy is something I'd like to learn more about. It's something I wanted to get into when I was a teenager, but career life never really went in that way. I think that's a very poignant kind of question, given what we've been talking about today, is that art, any kind of art, can be an expression of emotion or ideas, and in some cases it can be cathartic. I mean, this is what Aristotle thought about theatre and tragedy. Even not just creating art, but going to see art can help us can educate our emotions and actually help us to become better people. So the ancient philosophers themselves thought that art making and viewing art, going to see art, can actually make us better people. And that might be to do with the moral content of the artwork. So the tragic characters, they're generally given to us as deep down kind of morally good, but they're flawed. And the reason we relate to them is because they're like us. Because again, like the first question, like, none of us are morally perfect. But when it comes to creating art itself, like, that will be also a way of kind of trying to kind of calm our nervous system in some cases, and it's been shown to like help depression and anxiety and dementia as well. So it can make us it's good for our health, but it can also make us morally better people. Unfortunately, what's interesting is in the immoral artist case, it's a really interesting question, like whether this art helped them. I'd not thought about that before. I mean, Hitler carried on making art even after he was rejected from art school. Sometimes you think, what would have happened if he'd been let into art school? But clearly he found it a cathartic way of navigating the world. But it just so happens that his artworks, they look pretty, but they're actually really quite sinister. So in that case, it's what they're communicating as well as what they're doing for him. Yeah, I've not thought about that before. Thank you.
Is this the time of the evening when we allow Robin to ask a question? No, Robin, it's not. We have one more question at the back, and then a very quick relevant question from Robin. I'm actually very strict with Robin, you'll notice.
Hi, my name is Patrick. Thank you very much for your talk. It's very thought-provoking. And I want to suggest to you that there's actually a number of factors here that play. One, usually artwork is produced, well, obviously by an artist, but there usually is also somebody who commissions, who has an influence on what actually is portrayed and how it's portrayed. So you talk about morality, does that morality come into it as well? Then there's this idea that once the artwork is produced, it starts to create a life of its own. It becomes an object that, without even going back to why it was created and who created it, has got an influence on who sees it, and it has a life of its own.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And then, of course, there's people viewing it, which you touched on. So I think it's far more complicated than saying, was this artist moral or immoral? Also, as you said, nobody is fully moral. So where do you draw the line? If you look at that in that way, that nobody's totally moral, does the artwork then come from the immoral element of this person, or is it not?
Thank you very much.
That's a really interesting point you made at the end about if people are that complicated, surely the artwork's going to be that complicated. And I again, I've not really thought about that, so thank you. I think you're right. We do. I mean, I'm trying to think. With just pick a different example. Picasso's paintings. Very complicated man, fascinating man, obviously extremely talented. And his oeuvre is so vast, actually, and as I'm sure you all know, like his early work, before he started experimenting and developing Cubism, he had the blue period. It was meant to be like kind of like depressive period, and he really experimented a lot. And I think that, and then obviously his famous paintings of his many lovers. I think that the kind of breadth of his oeuvre shows the breadth of him as a person. And I think it is important to note that. Like, I think with the spotlight put on artists that's been happening in the past 10, 15 years, I think you can take seriously an artist's immorality and try, as me and this couple of other philosophers are trying to show, that there is an important connection between the two. We shouldn't separate the art from the artist, but you can still hold quite a subtle view, which is that we're not. So when people talk about Picasso, always misogynist, I always think like, yeah, but loads of people are. Like, he's not. I mean, even I still battle with internalized misogyny. So he wasn't special in that regard. He wasn't like a monster in that regard. Unfortunately, these things are quite common. I think it's important to remember that when we're looking at his artworks. And that's the other thing as well. It's perfectly compatible to say that an artwork has immoral properties, if you want to talk like a philosopher, or it's a bit immoral, but overall it's a brilliant work of art. And, with Picasso's works, they are so important for the development of artistic vision and what art can even be, that might surpass the immorality. But what we shouldn't do is ignore the glaring immorality that is in them. I think you can just hold the two at the same time.
Yeah, you're not saying that only completely moral work should be exhibited.
I think that would be really boring.
Yeah.
Plus, it wouldn't, going back to the question before, it wouldn't be honest.
Yeah.
Like, why can't we talk about Picasso being misogynist?
Yeah.
He was a misogynist. I know loads of misogynists. Like, we should talk about it.
Complete change of subject. It's time for Robin to ask his question.
Following on Tim's question, I think what sprung to mind was the Rorschach ink blot test, where a therapist looks at the reaction of the observer, and so therefore, I think there's two sides to this, isn't there? There's the actual object of art itself and its history and its provenance, and the reaction of the observer. So I'm just wondering, if art therapy is going to work, then you have to know both sides.
Right, yeah, thank you. I don't know if this will fully answer this question, but I'm going to say it anyway, because it kind of gets to the role of the viewers come up quite a lot in the questions. I think it's really important to note that, but I think that with artworks, going back to that point of communication as well, I think they have meaning. And like acts of communication, I think their meaning that derives from their original context is something we have to take seriously. Now, what a viewer might get from the artwork, that's still important, especially and an issue if they then go on to, if they become a worse person for it, whatever. But I think there's a difference between an artwork meaning something and it having a certain significance for people. And I think that distinction is important. So Van Gogh, for instance, painted, one of his paintings is of the Yellow House, where he lived. Now, looking at that painting, it might remind you of your holidays with your family or something. That's perfectly nice, and I'm not trying to say that that's not important. Say it reminded you of your grandmother's house or something. But Van Gogh's painting of the Yellow House is not about your grandmother's house. Its meaning is integral, is derived from the fact that that was the house he was living in with Gauguin when, this is another reason I hate Gauguin, because he bullied Van Gogh. He was really horrible to Van Gogh. It's also the house that he cut off his ear and had the mental breakdown. And I think that as an act of communication is more, that's to do with the meaning and the aboutness of the painting. If it reminds you of a holiday, that's fine. But you can see in kind of more sinister cases how that would also be relevant. So I think we do need to just maintain that conceptual distinction. I don't know if that fully answers your question.
I'm just thinking of a Hitler supporter, or a Nazi.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And actually that gets, and I was surprised this didn't come up, but I was actually quite pleased it didn't. The moral relativist position. Some people might think, well, we're just projecting our own moral values onto these paintings. But I tend to be a moral. I think there are objective moral values. I'm not sure metaphysically what they are or how they are, but I know what is right and what's wrong, and I know that non-consensual sexual violence and slavery, etc., is wrong, and I think everyone would agree. So I think these artworks, we can quite clearly say these artworks have very robust immoral properties, even if someone gets the wrong idea. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Daisy. Well, we're at time. So before we say thank you to Daisy and everyone who's helped, I just want to mention our next talk, which is February the 18th. I managed to make a note of the date this time. From Neil Williams. So yeah, a few days after Valentine's Day, our Valentine's Day special. Bring a date. If you weren't already planning to, or meet one here, either way. Anyway, Neil is going to be talking about love, of course, but love of nature and the environment. And he's going to be exploring whether it's more like, what did he say? Is it like loving sandwiches or 80s hip hop? Which I'm sure is very relatable for all of us. Or is it more like loving our spouses and family members? Also relatable for many of us. So he's going to talk about that. So please do book on. It's already up on the website, and look forward to hopefully seeing many of you there. And finally, just say a big thank you to everyone for coming. I thought great questions.
Brilliant
I enjoyed them very much. I think Daisy did too.
I did.
Big thank you for Marta for wrestling the AV into good behaviour. It's not easy, so we appreciate that. Thanks to Adrian for skipping lightly up and down the stairs like a mountain goat. Thank you, Adrian. Thank you to the lovely Robin, as always. And a huge thank you to Daisy for being with us tonight. Thank you very much.